The Middle East, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Hamas is the main obstacle to a Gaza hostage release deal. Talks have stalled, and Netanyahu says that Israel, with the US support, is exploring other options. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump weighed in, saying he believes Hamas will be hunted down. In Europe, Italy's Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani says Rome can no longer accept carnage and famine in Gaza. While criticising Israel's actions, Tajani made it clear that Italy will not yet recognise a Palestinian state, unlike France. He insists recognition must come only alongside formal recognition on the state of Israel. Well, joining us to look at these developments, Jordan Cope, a Middle East expert who is joining us from Dallas. Jordan, let's first look at the comments from Netanyahu and Trump's recognition of the situation. The Israeli Prime Minister saying that it is Hamas who need to resolve these situations and look towards a ceasefire in the face of concerning reports coming out of Gaza. The US, as they often do, backing Israel, but also saying that Hamas will be hunted down. Is this potentially signalling the next step if a ceasefire deal can't be agreed, with Hamas targeted at a more extreme and potentially more devastating military impact than we've seen already?
So just to clarify, nobody wants this war to continue. Nobody wanted this war to be fought in the first place. Unfortunately, we have to remind people why it began, because people have simply also turned the page on the recent massacres committed against the Druze in Syria as well. When it comes to minorities within the Middle East, they get massacred and people simply turn the page because they don't take the threat of Sunni Islamist terrorism that seriously. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas invaded Israel, killed 1,200 people, butchering many in the most inhumane fashion one could imagine. It seems right now that this war has persisted for 2 years, everybody wants it to come to an end, except for Hamas. Because Hamas ultimately realizes that the longer this war continues, the better its case for delegitimizing Israel. And Hamas has instituted in its charter what its ultimate goal is, which is to destroy Israel. So what Hamas is trying to do is to prolong this conflict. It doesn't want to return the remaining 50 hostages so it can declare victory, so it can manipulate Israel in the future to giving concessions, and so that it can ultimately remain in power. Now, Israel has fought this war for two primary purposes. One, because, I guess three. One, because it had to. Two, in order to ensure that Hamas never is able to commit these attacks again, thereby making sure that it can't stay in government. And three, and perhaps also just most importantly, getting the hostages home. Now, the United States and Israel have recognized that Hamas has been the primary obstacle throughout this whole process. Israel has returned disproportionate amount of prisoners within its system, many of whom some of the worst terrorists known in recent history, to the Gaza Strip and to the West Bank in return for a significantly smaller number of hostages, sometimes a ratio of 20 to 1 or even higher. So Hamas is ultimately the obstacle. They don't want this war to end, or they want it to end in a way where they can remain in power. And if we want to stop bloodshed and carnage in the future, we have to prevent designated terrorist organizations such as Hamas from killing 1,200 people at a moment's whim in the near future.
Yes, Jordan, of course, I want to look now to the comments coming out of Italy. There has been a lot of conversation from European nations, most notably France, about the ongoing situation in the Gaza enclave. Is there a possibility that Israel can continue their offensive and carry out their aims in this war, but also allowing the aid that's waiting on the borders of Gaza, the UN aid inside, to stop the devastation that's being seen in the Gaza Strip?
So Israel ultimately, just to clarify what Israel's done, Israel from the beginning of the war has actually allowed more aid into Gaza than it did before. It's ultimately, with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation right now, just to give some further context, they've provided approximately 2.1 million meals since the end of May. There are approximately 2 million residents in the Gaza Strip. It's a significant effort underway. But Israel has also allowed over 2 million tons of aid into the Gaza Strip since the war began. It's gone through significant efforts to preserve civilian lives, millions of evacuation warnings, phone calls, etc., to make sure that civilians can stay out of harm's way. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to every war, there will be civilian casualties. But as military expert John Spencer has also noted, despite this warfare being conducted in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, Israel, in terms of modern urban warfare, has still managed to keep the civilian to combatant ratio significantly low. And so what Israel is now going to do, Israel has requested, or at least allowed, and it's beginning to coordinate with Jordan and the UAE to begin their airdrop humanitarian assistance campaigns that they did previously. The United Nations also bears, I guess, some responsibility for some current food insecurity, even though it doesn't seem that the conditions for famine have been met. The United Nations has been withholding, according to the GHF, tens of thousands of pounds of humanitarian aid, largely out of political spite. GHF didn't necessarily clarify the reason, but it's clear it's largely out of political disagreements with Israel, its frustrations with Israel for making sure that UNRWA doesn't continue to sustain Hamas in the Gaza Strip and to sustain radicalism throughout the territories. But Israel ultimately is still allowing more aid to come in, even at the risk of ultimately advancing and enhancing Hamas's capabilities in the Gaza Strip and sustaining them.
Yes, Jordan, I just want to pick up on the figures that you mentioned there as we do bring this conversation towards a close. You say that just over 2 million meals have gone through the GHF aid distribution system, but we know that there is around that number, if not slightly more, people living in Gaza. So that's one meal since the end of May that's been going through this GHF aid route and aid distribution centre. We're looking at a situation where there are reports of children dying of acute malnourishment. There are reports that are saying that there is a very limited amount of medicine and supplies needed for these children to survive. I understand the situation that you're saying around Hamas getting that aid, and that, of course, is an extremely difficult situation if the Hamas group is being fed and strengthened through this aid that is there for the civilians. But at what point is there an acknowledgement of the situation that is there on the ground from the Israeli government? The reports from every group in there, in the Gaza Strip, almost every single humanitarian group says that famine is at a high level, that children are dying and that it is getting worse. Surely the efforts that have happened till now might be one thing, but moving forward with that international pressure, potentially more needs to be done.
So, Josh, I'm glad you clarified me. I made that clarification. I actually made a mistake with the number. The GHF has actually provided far higher number of meals. It's provided 90 million meals since the end of May, 45 times more than the number just stated. It's a significant effort. I'd like to clarify the international community has systemic bias when it comes to Israel. When it comes to the United Nations itself, over 50% of all resolutions in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have targeted Israel, not just in this year alone, in many recent years, going way back. Now, when it comes to the allegation of famine, the allegations and their bias continue against Israel because much of the international community has a bone to pick to Israel simply by its mere existence. So, when
but Jordan, is every group that is making these claims biased? Is every group wrong? Israel is one side. Of course, the amount of independent reporting happening in Gaza is limited because international journalists aren't allowed in. If you've got more than 100 NGOs and charities saying one thing and one group saying another, why is all of that information discredited?
You have institutions that are leading this PR assault, such as Amnesty International, which have systemic issues when it comes to anti-Semitism and racism. I encourage you to read my essay I published in the Jerusalem Post a while back about that. You have campaigns such as those coming from Human Rights Watch, which the founder of the very organization has disowned the organization because of its radical biases that have amounted over time. One must not forget also the United Nations official, Tom Fletcher, who once accused that there were 14,000 children who were on the cusp of dying in 2 days. That proved to be a lie.
Yes.
A lot of the health statistics coming out of the Gaza Strip, unfortunately, are coming from the health ministry of Gaza, which is run by Hamas, which has fudged statistics time and time again. It initially made it seem that women and children were those predominantly dying in the conflict. And then when people started protesting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, it became apparent that Israel was actually far more precise with whom it was targeting. As noted by Hamas, 72% of those targeted in the Strip, or at least those representing within the casualty statistics, were actually men and people of generally a fighting age, sometimes underage, but that's because 50% of the Gaza's population is under 18. So the reality is that Hamas constantly lies about numbers, it constantly lies about health statistics, and the reality is that even though there is a lot of fog when it comes to understanding how this war is proceeding, we ultimately cannot trust Hamas's statistics, and we can't trust the international community that has a bone to pick with Israel, and that
Yes.
ultimately time and time
Jordan,
again...
I'm so sorry to interrupt and cut you short there. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you ever so much for that insight and that information. And we will, of course, continue to monitor the situation in Gaza.